Cryptocurrency is the greatest financial scam in human history, and it's only getting worse.
Only value of Bitcoin is what the other guy will pay for it.
Bitcoin burns 2% of the world's electricity or so to be able to process somewhere between 3 to 7 transactions per second across the entire world. It never could work for payments.
When people buy Bitcoin, they rarely use it to buy goods and services. They're really buying access to a Ponzi scheme.
One of the main effects of inflation on the use of cash is that it gradually makes it more inconvenient, reaching a point where your wallet can hardly fold due to the amount of bills inside. However, the purchasing power of that huge stack of bills cannot cover even the weekly expenses. This is leading to a rapid digitization of commercial activity. In this video, I aim to explore the two sides of a world where all economic life is completely digitized. It has been over 10 years since the birth of Bitcoin. A decade ago, various groups of enthusiasts around the world firmly believed that this invention would lead to a definitive evolution of free exchange networks. It would be the ultimate weapon against currency monopolies, central banks, banking fraud, and inflation. I can't think of a better way to summarize this duality than under the title of the pyramid versus the network. Little is said, in my opinion, about monopolies, their effects, and the many incentives that exist to generate and maintain them. In the most benign cases, a single transport company holds a monopolistic agreement with the current power and makes you wait for long periods, causing you to arrive late everywhere. Without competition, companies can provide poor service, and there's little you can do about it. What a monopoly seeks is to ensure by any means the largest possible market share. The most extreme case would be to control a territory through paid hitmen and thus exert the will of the rulers over an entire population. They could force that population to pay tribute and submit to their rules. Education should be monopolized so that everyone is properly educated within the regime from early childhood, so that not only do they not rebel, but also defend the monopoly even with their lives. The main needs of the subjects should be controlled by as few people as possible. Electricity, healthcare, streets, police, even culture should be under strict control of the regime to extract rents from every aspect of the subjects' lives. However, no monopoly would be as profitable and give as much power as the monopoly over the currency that the subjects use every day to trade or pay for all products and services that would already be under the control of the monopoly. Marco Polo recounts how Kublai Khan, leader of the Mongols in China during the second half of the 13th century, became the wealthiest man in history through a forced currency paper money, imposing the death penalty on those who refused to accept it. While Kublai was at the helm of the Yuan dynasty, several times a year, a decree was issued informing citizens of the empire that anyone possessing gold, silver, gems, or pearls should bring them to what was essentially the emperor's central bank to exchange them for the forced currency paper. Besides the death threats, citizens found it convenient to use a currency that was easy to transport and accepted throughout the empire. Kublai Khan's success was largely due to his currency solving one of the main factors that contribute to a currency's success: friction. At the same time, the emperor made the greatest possible demonstration of how profitable fiat money can be, which basically means by decree. In the documentary Who Killed Bitcoin, we briefly tell the story of the abandonment of the gold standard, and if you remember, friction played a crucial role. People began to exchange the deposit certificates issued by banks directly, and fewer people used those certificates to withdraw gold from the vaults. Why withdraw gold when we can move and exchange value without friction with the paper provided by the bank? Eventually, bankers realized that if no one withdrew the deposits, they could issue more deposit certificates, even though there was no more gold in their vaults. As long as everyone doesn't come to withdraw gold at the same time, they only need enough deposits to cover the daily demand. This is how fractional reserve banking originated, which to this day is the standard for all banks worldwide. Which is why one of their worst nightmares is bank runs. Maintaining the hegemony of the dollar is not something the US government has ever taken lightly. In 2011, the United States got involved as usual in the political conflicts that were looming over the Libyan government at the time. For the previous 40 years, Muammar al-Gaddafi ruled Libya as a dictator, and the United States, along with France and NATO, supported revolutionary guerrillas with the typical excuse of liberating the people. To no one's surprise, the altruistic facade of the American, French, and NATO governments, as revealed in emails from Hillary Clinton published by their eternal rival WikiLeaks, was nothing more than a business involving oil, weapons, and a particularity that Hillary specifically mentions in these emails.
In 2009, Gaddafi suggested a new currency called the gold dinar, which will be independent of the American dollar. The key objective of this new currency was to divert oil revenues towards state-controlled funds rather than American banks. The gold dinar was also going to replace oil transactions with the American dollars. Countries like Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola were ready to change their currencies and adopt the new one suggested by Muammar Gaddafi.
His 40 years of rule concluded with his decapitation and anal impalement, among other things, for threatening the hegemony of the American dollar. There is a very close relationship between war, monopolies, and money issued by central banks, especially the Federal Reserve of the United States. Wars seek to establish or solidify monopolies by fueling the military-industrial complex with discretionary money issuance that maintains its value through war, killing, persecuting, or imprisoning anyone who challenges its hegemony. One of the main differences between the pyramid and the network is that network participants engage voluntarily, while the pyramid employs a wide range of coercive strategies that have proven effective throughout history. The network is formed by individuals who, through mutual agreement, decide to participate in it, and that's why it exists. The network grows if its participants benefit from participating, and if so, it will attract more participants. In many cases, these networks are clandestine as a consequence of the coercion of the pyramidal structure, which sees the network as a threat to its interests. The underground economy is a clear example of mutually agreed networks that must operate outside the pyramid's regulations to survive. In the early days of the digital era, decentralized networks were the worst enemy of the monopoly on content distribution that we now know as copyright. Programs like uTorrent already allowed downloading and sharing files hosted on many networked computers.
By 1998, the music industry was raking in over $13 billion a year. And that's when an 18-year-old college dropout invented Napster, a program that transformed the world's computers into a peer-to-peer music sharing network. The record industry realized that in this future, they would lose control. So when Napster offered to pay $1 billion in exchange for a license to allow their users to keep copying, the record industry refused to evolve, parted with history, and started suing.
Such activities, which challenge monopolies sustained by state coercion, were the reason for cyber surveillance laws passed worldwide under the supposed excuse of combating terrorism and crime, but intentionally drafted to leave a window open to use these laws to pursue virtually anyone. To give you an idea, when Kim.com was arrested for piracy and violating copyright laws, the FBI stormed his house as if he were Pablo Escobar, terrifying his wife and daughters and halting all his progress, subjecting him to a long period of legal proceedings.
We have focused on the much bigger lie, which is not about my case, which is about every single New Zealander who is subjected to mass surveillance. That is a story that you should focus on. Get your priorities right.
We will.
I hope you will.
If they hadn't done this, Kim.com would probably be the established pioneer of all content streaming services that are now in the hands of Spotify, Netflix, or YouTube. Imagine how his arrest changes the course of internet history, especially because to this day, he remains a promoter and creator of networks.
We wanted to launch several new sites. One of them was Mega Movies, which was a Netflix competitor, and the aim was to license content from the big studios. We have Megabox. It would give the artists 90% of the earnings. It would give them an online platform where they can sell directly to their fan base. Because we were thinking about how can we reinvent this whole copyright model? How can we make it work for the artists and creators directly?
Julian Assange, the creator of WikiLeaks, spent 7 years confined to the Ecuadorian embassy in London as a political refugee. This lasted until June 17, 2022, when the UK approved Julian Assange's extradition to the United States. There, he will be tried for publishing documents from the US government, revealing that the American military had committed war crimes against civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq, including the murder of 2 journalists.
Their desire was simply to kill, and to find any excuse in the rules of engagement which permitted that killing. And the behavior of the pilots is like they are playing a computer game.
Light them all up.
If found guilty, Assange obviously faces life imprisonment. The creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, was very clear about what he was getting into. In fact, his disappearance from Bitcoin forums coincides with the moment when WikiLeaks announced that it would start accepting donations in Bitcoin. In 2013, the FBI arrested Ross Ulbricht, the creator of a website that allowed buying and selling all kinds of goods anonymously. On Silk Road, Bitcoin was used as a medium of exchange to achieve anonymity and resistance to censorship. As expected, the site was mainly used to buy and sell prohibited goods, mostly illegal drugs.
Entonces, ¿en qué consiste la ruta de la seda? Que tú, metiéndote en el sistema TOR, entras en una página, de allí te encuentras un listado de vendedores. Y además, debajo de cada vendedor, las opiniones de los que le han comprado, que son o positivas o negativas.
Es que es un feedback buenísimo.
Con lo cual, eso ya filtra en gran medida. Pero no basta eso, porque Ross descubrió el llamado scroll, que es un sistema de retención de las cantidades. Por cierto, todo esto va en bitcoins, ¿eh?
Claro,
el complemento del TOR es el bitcoin.
Sí.
Pues entonces el scroll hace que retenga la página el dinero en los bitcoins hasta que el cliente da el OK. Él ha hecho algo increíble, que al evitar con los envíos por correo los encuentros a la hora de hacer las transferencias de drogas, ha evitado millones de asesinatos diarios en el mundo, porque ya nunca más viene el listillo a darle al otro el palo de, oye, que yo digo que vengo con el dinero, pero no lo traigo. O yo digo que vengo con la droga y no traigo la droga. Vengo a robarte el dinero.
No, es que eso es buenísimo.
Eso ha sido el 90% de los casos.
Es un salto de evolución. Pero
claro, entonces la jueza dice que es un vulgar.
Regardless of one's judgment of their existence and whether it is correct for such exchanges to have been facilitated by the site, what really gives us a clue about how much monopolies punish their challengers is that the creator of Silk Road received a double life sentence with no possibility of parole.
The caricature they created was a violent drug lord. That is not who I am. That is a lie. It's a lie that was carefully crafted to justify keeping me in this cage until I die. It's a lie designed to turn you against me, to turn your heart off.
Both Julian Assange and Silk Road provided Bitcoin with its first dose of strong popularity. despite the fact that initially the media tended to either ignore it or outright criticize the project, suggesting that it was only useful for money laundering, financing terrorism, or similar activities. Essentially, what Julian Assange demonstrated was what the pyramid regularly does. Let's not forget that the pyramid's goal is not so much to regulate or promote ethical behavior, but to monopolize and control. If you're going to commit an act of terrorism, it has to be under their supervision and in favor of the pyramid's interests. But how does Bitcoin evade all these complications? The first documentary explains the role of Bitcoin mining. To summarize, mining is a distributed network of computers that provide computing power to the network, making attacking it terribly costly and incredibly unlikely to succeed. One of the fundamental aspects that keeps Bitcoin as a network and prevents it from becoming a pyramid over time is its consensus protocol. The proof of work aims to mathematically verify that transactions sent to the network meet the necessary conditions to be considered valid. The incentive for a miner to contribute computing power and perform proof of work is, on one hand, obtaining new bitcoins, whose issuance is periodically halved, so that over time, the only permanent incentive becomes the fees that users pay to have their transactions verified and added to the blockchain. What proof of work allows is that no one can arbitrarily influence the network, and that anyone who wishes to participate in this consensus protocol, to agree on which transactions are valid and which are not, must invest in computing power and compete for the rewards offered by the network, whether they be the newly issued bitcoins or, when the time comes, only the aggregated fees. But then are there consensus protocols that allow someone to arbitrarily influence the network they protect? Let's briefly talk about proof of stake. This consensus protocol does not rely on miners but on validators. Anyone can become a validator by holding a minimum required amount of coins. Instead of contributing computing power by investing in hardware to compete for the network's reward, validators simply own a quantity of tokens from that network, and with that, they can already participate in forming consensus. It's like owning shares in the network, and the more shares one has, the more power they have as a validator. The problem is that creators of a network based on this consensus mechanism often initially issue any amount of coins because the protocol does not require any computational effort to generate these new coins, unlike proof of work. As a consequence, they gain control over the network by issuing enough coins. It's as if we issued more shares of a company and assigned them to ourselves to have greater control over the company. This happened countless times in POS projects that turned out to be scams. In short, if we want the network to remain a network, the proof of work protocol is non-negotiable. Okay, so Bitcoin is indestructible, unalterable, and pure. It could never become a pyramid like what happens with the gold standard or with the proof of stake that we just mentioned. Yes and no. Bitcoin leverages having solved the problems of gold and fiat money. Unlike gold, Bitcoin is not confiscatable, nor does it allow fractional reserve banking. But regarding its use, the main disadvantage of gold that Bitcoin overcomes is friction. Paper currency solves friction, but opens the door to all the problems we already know, especially if it's a forced currency. Let's imagine that our goal is to turn Bitcoin back from a network into a pyramid to take control of its use, as the pyramid naturally seeks to do. Reintroducing friction would be the most effective method that has been shown throughout history worldwide. That is, we would need to make Bitcoin, despite being a digital asset, expensive to use and impractical. We cannot adulterate gold, but friction will allow us to offer paper currency over which we can exert control or practice fractional reserve banking. Sadly, what I'm describing is not just a hypothesis. This has already been put into practice, and it worked. Today, using Bitcoin, at least the version that appears most frequently in the media, is expensive and impractical.
Bitcoin can process between 3 and 7 transactions per second, and is now considered by many to be digital gold instead of digital cash. Its fees have ranged anywhere from several cents to tens of dollars per transaction, depending on the number of people trying to use the network at once.
This friction has already yielded the expected result, and today the vast majority does not use Bitcoin, but the regulated alternative that solves friction as expected and as centuries of history have taught us. Growing activity was approaching the 1 megabyte limit, and many began to wonder what was happening, why the limit was not raised to continue adding transactions and allow Bitcoin to scale exactly as planned. In these times of uncertainty, new players joined the ecosystem. Bitcoin had sparked interest from influential individuals, those with economic power or technical knowledge, and many of them wanted to take charge or take control of the project. Despite originating from a community whose members freely contributed code, computing power, or simply feedback, eventually there were enough incentives to take the reins. Blockstream emerged precisely at this moment. It's naive to think that Bitcoin, being an open source project, becomes automatically immune to manipulation. Although it's true that the design aims for resilience and resistance to censorship, what is subject to manipulation is everything else. Everything that surrounds, affects, and ultimately shapes the projects that use the name Bitcoin. So if the goal is to reintroduce friction, the fundamental pillar to achieve this will be to keep the block limit well below demand, causing the network to become congested. The discourse they instilled made use of a concept that has become very popular in recent years, even though by itself it doesn't mean anything: decentralization. In the system devised by Satoshi Nakamoto, decentralization specifically refers to the network not having a single point of attack, not being subject to jurisdiction, and the police not having anyone to knock down the door to tell them to shut down Bitcoin. Anyone with internet access can use the network at low cost, and where mining is prohibited, it will simply be mined clandestinely, or the devices will be moved elsewhere, where economic activity related to Bitcoin mining is more welcome. In other words, decentralization is the means by which a very specific objective is achieved: resistance to censorship. If you wanted to take control of Bitcoin, you would have to form a core of strong influence in development, confuse users, and control the main communication channels. In those same forums, something that was once obvious is now prohibited from being mentioned. One person, or at least one user, ended up being the dictator of all those forums, and after rounds and rounds of expelling anyone who pointed out the obvious, they were able to achieve their long-awaited consensus. The reason why mentioning that Bitcoin can truly scale was prohibited, as they explained, was that this idea lacked consensus and was a dangerous idea that could fragment the network. These fragmentations are known as splits. These occur when the same network splits into two series of different rules, resulting in two distinct networks. Miners must choose which network to lend their computing power to, and this is one of the reasons why it was considered a dangerous idea, because it causes the network effect to split into different networks instead of accumulating in a single large network. Once they abolished critical thinking, they managed to establish the discourse that the 1 megabyte block limit should not be raised, because this would result in greater centralization. And here we return to the deceptive use of the popular term decentralization. Within this narrative, it's important for blocks to weigh as little as possible so that anyone can download the blockchain onto a low-resource computer and personally ensure that no one is cheating.
Nodes have network power. Nodes get to decide how the network works. No, they don't. The one advantage non-mining nodes have over hosted services is that they are direct spectators of what's happening on the network. They have the privilege of enjoying trustlessness. They don't need to trust anybody. We can compare this to a football game. The game takes place on the arena before us, among the people doing transactions and the miners, which in a football game would translate to the players kicking the ball around and the referees deciding on the rules and when the rules are invalid and when the rules have been broken and when they have been followed. Nodes here would be the audience. Nodes would not need to trust the TV networks and commentators to hear what was going on in the game, but they could see it directly with their own eyes. But that doesn't give them a power to disagree or veto what's happening on the network. The audience of a football game can disagree all they like. The game will continue regardless of what they think. In the same way, a non-mining node can disagree with blocks all they like, but they're not rejecting these blocks by refusing to work on them, as we heard from the white paper. They're not accepting blocks by working on them. In fact, they're completely passive. They're completely passive. And so transactions and mining will continue completely regardless of what the non-mining nodes think about the blocks being mined.
If non-mining nodes were to define the validity of the protocol that governs the network, miners would be completely unnecessary. What this ridiculous narrative holds is that a non-mining node, without economic incentives or any risk, is equally as important as a miner, and that it's worth paying the cost of a disabled, slow, and expensive blockchain so that anyone can naively run a node, forgetting that the integrity of Bitcoin is based on a well-structured economic incentives model, not on the ability to personally validate transactions with a node without computing power. A non-mining node runs exactly the same software as a miner, but without computing power. It's a mere spectator with no incentives to protect the network and no resources to do so, even if it wanted to. If Bitcoin's security model truly relied on these nodes, it would be terribly insecure. Because, being nodes that practically don't invest resources, one could set up thousands of nodes on Amazon servers. There is no need for validation from a node without computing power and potentially with poor internet connection. As ridiculous as it may sound, they convinced enough newcomers to the ecosystem that this makes sense, and as a result, they reintroduced friction on the use of BTC. And today, everyone uses custodians. There are two ways in which BTC's friction bears fruit, but both end up with custodians. On one hand, it's directly using custodians, and not even considering using the blockchain. Most people, at least initially, don't even know the difference between the two. The second is attempting to use the Lightning Network, but most also use custodians for this, because to open Lightning Network channels, a transaction on the Bitcoin network is necessary, where the high costs and friction everyone seeks to avoid are present.
Before we get into another interesting debate about transaction fees on Bitcoin of perhaps, they'll be very low because all of the payments will be happening in the Lightning Network.
Right.
And so it kind of cannibalizes the demand for block space by moving everything off chain. The counter argument there is that participating on the Lightning Network also requires an on-chain transaction to open the channel and to close the channel. And then how many channel opening and closing do you need per person? I'd say you probably need like 8 per person. I'd go so far as to say like per couple of years. So let's say 4 per year, 4 transactions per year per person. And then you multiply that by 8 billion people.
Yeah.
That's still greater than the block size limit.
Correct.
There's just not enough block space to onboard everybody on chain onto Lightning, or even to use their cold storage, for not their payments, but for their long-term savings. They still need to do an on-chain transaction. So you'll see people worry about how can Bitcoin be decentralized if everybody's having to use custodians because going on chain is too expensive.
To explain this, they introduced another discourse on top of everything mentioned before, the Bitcoin standard. You'll realize that having explained all of the above, there's no need for me to explain where this Bitcoin standard idea is heading. There's a very popular mantra in this ecosystem that says, not your keys, not your coin, meaning without your private key, they're not your coins. This private key is one of the most important elements of the entire ecosystem. The true power that Bitcoin enables us is the possibility of being the only ones in control of our money, despite it being digital. Until the creation of Bitcoin, there was no form of digital money that allowed us this. If we have money in some digital bank, it's actually the bank that has power over that money, and we have nothing more than permission to use it, subject to changing conditions and potential restrictions. To make use of the blockchain, and thus of the benefits of Bitcoin, we have to use a wallet that grants us our private key. Because for the first time in recorded history, we can have absolute control over a digital form of money simply by knowing a code in the form of 12 words. This difference is the main reason why users choose to use Bitcoin, and in turn, it's the reason why a user would be willing to pay a fee. If we limit the block size well below user demand, most will have to resort to custodians or directly to other alternatives. the bulk of users will turn to centralized services, nullifying the whole idea that non-mining nodes contribute to decentralization. How mining is incentivized without lifting the block limit. For miners, this limit acts as a cap on supply, making them dependent on the new bitcoins issued with each block, as they are not allowed to absorb more transaction volume. If miners are economically reliant on the newly issued bitcoins, it means they are dependent on those bitcoins having sufficient value. This undermines the incentive system on which Bitcoin's security relies, making it dependent on the asset's price. Relying entirely on an element as predictable as its price is not at all risky to support Bitcoin's security, right? Though it may seem tragicomic, the most realistic answer to this question comes from one of the leading developers of Bitcoin Core, Peter Todd, who played a central role in imposing the 1 megabyte limit, and more recently something called replace by fee, whose implementation opened the door to one of the biggest problems that Bitcoin solves when it is not being distorted: double spending and transaction reversibility. Peter Todd proposes lifting the emission limit, making it no longer a fixed supply of 21 million, but rather an indefinite emission. So far, everything Peter Todd proposed has eventually been implemented. And the reality is that in this latter point, he is correct. Issuing new bitcoins is the only way to incentivize mining without lifting the block limit. When in 2017, the chain bifurcated into two different implementations, everyone wanted to keep the BTC ticker on their side, as it had an established popularity. Today, the Blockstream implementation retains the BTC ticker, because when the chain split into two different versions, the Blockstream version eventually retained a larger share of the computing power. Firstly, Blockstream had promised to increase the block size limit, thereby ensuring that miners remained plugged into their implementation for longer. However, this never happened, and everything was ultimately determined by the price. At the time of the split, the dispute was already beginning to be reflected in the price of each chain's native token. Looking at historical prices, from August 2017, both tokens were fluctuating between $500 and $1,000. At that time, nobody would have thought to say that Bitcoin is a store of value, and the argumentative conflict was based on how peer-to-peer money should scale.
People are looking for a new way of paying, and not through banks, and not with euros, not with dollars, something new.
How did the chain that does not aim to become peer-to-peer money manage to keep the BTC ticker? In the documentary, we mentioned that the owners of Bitfinex and Tether are directly involved with Blockstream, and at the same time, all these entities benefit from Bitcoin's inability to operate correctly, from the network being saturated, and from anyone wanting to be exposed to Bitcoin's price having to do so indirectly through a custodian. While exchanges have always existed as places for trading and speculation, with a disabled Bitcoin, they become not only an option, but the only option for many to turn to. This results not only in the possibility of profiting from Bitcoin's disability, but also in the ability to concentrate a large portion of that market and manipulate it as desired. On the other hand, we have Tether, which, since its inception, despite being the highest capitalized stablecoin and the most traded cryptocurrency in the world, has not been properly audited to this day. Tether has three factors that make it clear it's a dangerous bubble. Its reserves are mostly composed of debt, whose creditors are unknown, and subject to a default without coverage for the investor. They avoid audits and lie about it. And as if this weren't enough, they have a history of moving funds between their exchange Bitfinex and Tether reserves to feign solvency for a short period of time. This was, in fact, one of the events that caught the attention of users who drew a connection between the movements of Bitfinex and Tether, concluding that Bitfinex uses Tether to inflate and manipulate the price of BTC.
When Tether updated their terms of service and their website to basically make it so that now they could be backed by effectively anything, and the concept of unbacked for Tether became much slipperier. And now we are at where we're at now, where Tether has released attestations showing that approximately 50% of their backing is in unknown commercial paper. And so Tether no longer even pretends to be backed one-to-one by dollars, but is now backed by a variety of different securities and receivables, in which we don't have a good view into what their appropriate market value would be.
Other scandals involve them with two exchanges that turned out to be Ponzi schemes, Celsius and FTX, both declared bankrupt. Tether's reserves, mainly admitted as unbacked debt, and the audits avoided for years, and to this date, indicate that Tether issues new tokens to manipulate the market as convenient. From the moment Bitfinex and Tether denied being controlled by the same group of people, given that this would raise suspicions about the implications of the owners of an exchange being able to issue dollars out of thin air and introduce them into the market through their exchange, Tether should have been discarded from any investor's portfolio and from the list of any serious platform. During the fork that attempted to save Bitcoin from the clutches of those who did not want it to scale, Tether played a fundamental role in inflating token prices through Bitfinex. And since then, the relationship between the issuance of new Tethers and the price of BTC has been clear. In the same way that friction over the use of gold determined the success of fiat money issued by central banks, BTC once again took the form of a pyramid by fixing the block limit at 1 megabyte, allowing an increasingly smaller number of users to access the blockchain and leaving the majority dependent on dishonest custodians. So, how could this version of Bitcoin help us regain control over our money and provide us with an alternative to the systems that have abused their position over and over again for centuries? Bitcoin Cash, or BCH, is the result of the unwavering desire to have a form of peer-to-peer digital money that serves the world in its quest for freedom, to design a future free from institutional coercion and economic violence. I think this is the way to go, and I know I'm not alone. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'll see you around.
But there was a point at which I used to use Bitcoin all the time for small purchases, actually plane tickets and coffee and everything else. And I thought that the goal, as it always is, in any kind of monetary innovation, is to seek adoption and use, because you've got a big problem. You've got a network effect to overcome with dollarization and national monetary systems, generally speaking. So you need people to be able to use it, have friendly interfaces, have producers accept it, consumers adopt it, and see ever more use. That's always the goal of any money. And to my great shock, I woke up one day and discovered that Bitcoin was actually almost unusable, actually. And I felt like my beloved cryptocurrency had been invaded by somebody who was not in favor of it ever becoming a money and had throttled it in a way that made it far less useful and far slower and far more expensive than national money. So obviously under those conditions, Bitcoin couldn't ever perform, and it was a shock.
A few years after we were fighting so much about how important it is and this is the sound direction for Bitcoin, all these Bitcoin Cash people, they were saying, yeah, I mean, but Lightning is kind of too complex and a bit annoying. I mean, now it's I'm waking up and I'm having this hangover and we won the war, but they have some points. they have some points, and it feels awful to say. And I sometimes I've even been thinking hey, were we the bad guys? During that whole war, Lightning versus big blocks, were we the bad guys? Were we the ones that weren't listening?
We cannot repeat it enough. Bitcoin is ready for everyday use. If you want your investment to pay off, we need to incentivize the network effect by spending our Bitcoin as much as we can and replace them back right after. This can be done easily now with low fee and no KYC.
I've always been a supporter of Bitcoin, and when we started development on K.IM, our intention was to do this with Lightning and Liquid and make it all work. But in our testing environment and developing and trying to implement Lightning and Liquid for over a year, we just got increasingly frustrated because it didn't work. And we've run large volume tests and ran into scalability issues and ran into so many problems that we had to start looking for an alternative. And we ended up with Bitcoin Cash.
So we'll have Lightning Network, basically,
where you and I can transact on this second layer infinitely, instantaneously, cheaply, and when we're ready, that transaction, the net result of all the transactions are going to get settled, and then they get sent to layer 1 on the blockchain, and that's when we resolve the transactions. Does that make sense?
I've heard that was going to happen for years.
That's gonna, yeah,
Right?
it's been in the works for a long time because it's a very complicated system to build, but that's one of the solutions.
Who's building it?
The core team from Bitcoin Core. Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of sounds like Robinhood trading Bitcoin.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's derivatives. That's right. Which is one of the criticisms that the Bitcoin Cash team had. Their criticism was you're literally recreating the current financial system, because who's to say that we can't just print an infinite amount of currency on the Lightning Network, because you're no longer using that tech. You are using another layer that is not even connected to Bitcoin, just like we did with cash, because we got rid of base layer 1. We got rid of gold.
That's a great point.
Yeah, we'll go to layer 2. Cool. But then who owns that? Who controls that? Who prints that?